There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Welcome, everybody, to the Your Mountain podcast. My name's David Wilms. I'm your host. As always, I'm sitting here with Mike McGrady.
David.
How are you doing, Mike?
Never been better.
I like to hear that. Never better. What can we do to make things better than never better?
Maybe if Nephi was still here.
I'm still here.
Hey, there he is.
Still here.
Nephi.
Good to be here, Dave.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I missed you guys, to tell you the truth. We've worked in the same office for a long, long time, and recently we don't anymore, and I miss you guys.
It's a lot quieter in my office.
I get a lot more done.
So do I.
Weird.
Yeah.
Well, so this week, like we did a couple of weeks ago, we're going to take this is going to be a little bit shorter episode, and we're going to take a dive into a topic of national interest related to your land, particularly land in this instance, land, water, and wildlife. Today, as a lot of people may have heard, because there's been a number of newspaper articles, press releases, blogs, social media posts about this. Senator Mike Lee from Utah, on June 29th, was giving a presentation at the Sutherland Institute. He was on a public lands panel, or it was a public lands forum, right? And he was given a presentation there at the Sutherland Institute. Sutherland Institute is a conservative think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Right.
And he was giving a talk on public lands, and he threw out three proposals, ideas for bills that he was looking to introduce here in the near term. One, he wanted to introduce a bill that would limit the use of the president's authority to designate new monuments under the Antiquities Act. The second one was creating effectively a new Homestead Act, the idea being to allow public land to be used for things like affordable housing, construction of schools or medical clinics, research, that sort of thing. And the third was more a long-term goal of transferring federal lands to the states. And so that's a lot to bite off.
If you're an organization that where public lands transfer is important to your fundraising, this was a giant gift.
It has the potential, at least it appears that way, right? It
was a huge issue.
It's becoming a big issue, right? And we are going to attempt to step back and objectively take a look at these three proposals and walk you through exactly what they are and what they aim to accomplish, and their likelihood of succeeding, at least in the near term, and then looking forward into some of the looking out a little bit farther. What's the likelihood of succeeding? But before we do that,
so there was a lot of comment on social media about this, and so everybody. I know I read about it on my Facebook feed probably 4 or 5 times. People coming and saying, "Oh yeah," and then it's like 1 or 2 sentences. Can you believe that Mike Lee said this? To which I could say, number one, I can believe that he said that. But number two, it was spotty in terms of what you could learn, because basically the message was it's the same transfer federal lands issue.
I think it's important that what you're talking about is there are selective quotes or there's discussions that don't provide the full information, and I think it's important for folks to actually go read the speech. It's available on Senator Lee's website. It's available on the Sutherland Institute's website. It's kind of a fascinating read. The news after President Trump was elected was beside themselves. They didn't understand why. And what they discovered was an underlying angst of an issue. And I think it's important to read this speech to understand the counter argument.
So where Utah's coming from, why?
Where Utah's coming from, where the public land transfer sort of issue is. And so...
why it's out there. Why is it something... Why is there some momentum behind it? Why do people keep bringing it up?
So Senator Lee, in his speech, sort of outlined a number of very stark contrasting themes that tee up why these things are being proposed. It was a real big East Coast versus West. Not even West Coast, but East versus West.
And even more big urban versus rural.
Urban versus rural, where you have the East, where only 5% has public lands in it. The rest is privately owned land. In the West, half of the land is owned by the federal government. And so he was painting a picture of, and really even hearkening back to the days of when the kings of England would take over the forests and say, this is my land that is set aside specifically for my hunting, my personal use, even though you had developed it or you were relying on it for your own personal use. You can't do that anymore. This is for the preservation of my hunting species. And so he's calling, so basically in this speech, if correct me, right, he's saying the East Coast quote unquote elites is the king. Right, yeah. So he's not analogizing the United States government necessarily as the king as much as the groups that want to fly in, stay at a fancy hotel in Aspen or whatever, take some pictures of wildlife, and get out and treat the area as a zoo, never minding the locals and the impact that has on them. How the national control over those public lands impact the ability of the locals to even make an economic use, to have the dignity of a good job and the opportunity to have land that is affordable to develop and turn into something beneficial for the United States.
And as Westerners ourselves, sometimes it's hard not to be a little bit empathetic to that idea, right? To the not to necessarily the ideas that he's putting forward, but the idea of local control over local issues.
And the last sort of point that's worth mentioning here, just to give a synopsis of his speech, is that the reason it's so much of a focus for in Utah is he was explaining that by the time Utah became a state, Manifest Destiny had kind of ended. That opportunity for development and the westward migration kind of stopped. And so when they got their articles of mission, becoming a state in the Union, it said specifically that the federal government would transfer the lands for the sale and use in Utah, but they never got actuated over time. And so they feel like they missed out that opportunity that all the states to the east were able to handle and take benefit, in their words, from. So Utah feels like they missed out, and they still want that promise fulfilled for them.
And it wouldn't be just, to be clear, not just Utah that would have, and I'm using air quotes here, that would have missed out, right? It's not,
sure.
It's really, the idea are, a lot of these Western states were the ones that were the final states admitted to the Union. You'd already had, a good portion of the settlement of the West by European settlement, Western migration from Eastern states to settle the West. That had largely taken place in all of these Western states. And so I think I want to make it clear, it wasn't strictly a Utah issue. Right?
No, it's not. It's not strictly a Utah issue. I think Utah is located in that more arid states, that those states didn't get developed as fast as the ones that were less arid. But for them, there's an argument and sort of a boiling discussion about, hey, we never got our opportunity, and we want that now, and here's a need now. And in fact, there's language where the federal government said they were going to do this, but they never did.
And this is a
federal government breaking promises.
This is contested. This is contested as a legal argument, right? I mean, there are people that are saying, "Oh yeah, we've got this language," and then there are other legal scholars. The law of conservation of expertise. For every opinion, there's an equal and opposite opinion. There are other folks that are saying, "No way." This is well established. There is no legal argument here, but go ahead and make one anyway.
Well. So let's talk about what Senator Lee is trying to do to realize this manifest destiny 100 years later, 120 years later, whatever it is. Let's talk about what he's trying to do. Let's talk about this first bill. And start by saying, none of us have seen the language of any of these proposed bills. So we're completely speculating as to their content based on statements he made in this one address, right? Yep. Mm-hmm. We don't know really what's in there. So a lot of the reaction we're seeing are to his words, not the actual language. So I want to put that placeholder in there.
Remembering his audience too. So he's speaking to a given audience of folks that are really pro transfer of lands.
Sure. And I don't doubt that he's saying what he intends to do. But let's remember that to withhold final judgment until we've seen the actual language. But let's make let's run through this. So the first bill, this is the bill that would limit the use of the president's authority to designate new monuments under the Antiquities Act. First of all, really briefly, the Antiquities Act is Congress passed it in, I think it was 1906. Somebody's going to correct me on that if I'm wrong. Somebody's going to correct me if I'm wrong on that. But Congress passed that, and it authorizes the president to set aside really culturally significant areas to designate them as national monuments. First national monument actually was designated in Wyoming, Devil's Tower. The use of the Antiquities Act over time has become a little more controversial, and we've seen that manifest with the Bears Ears designation and then redesignation, and same thing with Grand Staircase Escalante.
Both in Utah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
There's a theme here, everyone.
Right. Mm-hmm. So what he wants to do is limit that authority, and I think he specifically cited so that in the way that Congress has already limited that authority in states like Alaska and Wyoming.
Right. And to be clear, he's naming it Protecting Utah's Rural Communities Act. So it appears as though this is targeting designations in Utah and not in other states at this time.
Right. And this isn't a newfangled idea in Utah. Utah for years, their delegation, their state legislatures have been looking for ways to have the same protections as Wyoming received when Grand Teton National Park was made a park, redesignated from a monument to a park, and the same protections that apply in Alaska that are even more recent than that.
Yeah, and the difference being, I think we've talked about this, that Alaska, there's basically a minor number. So Alaska's authority still exists under 5,000 acres, correct? And then if it's larger than that, it has to go to Congress.
I can't remember the exact number, but it's whereas in Wyoming, it's
just no
designation without state approval.
And in Alaska, if it gets bigger than the size, no.
Then it still needs state approval. So that's what he's looking for in Utah. So let's take a look at that. What are the consequences of that occurring? Well, first of all, let's look at what the consequences have been in Wyoming and Alaska. Wyoming's easy for us. That's where we're from. It's pretty easy to analyze. This is my perspective. We haven't had a monument designated since Grand Teton National Park was designated a monument prior to being a park. First, right? But last time I checked, Wyoming has a complete suite of wildlife. All the wildlife that it had at the time European settlement began. That wildlife all still exists today. And the federal land that was there is still there today. It's viewed as one of the more wild places in the lower 48. It's viewed as we've kept a lot of that Western heritage.
We have more national forests than the size of the state of Connecticut. We have more wilderness area than the size of the state of Delaware. It's so.
Yeah, and I think more than that even. I think more like New Jersey.
It's pretty big. But
it's
been a long time since I've.
Right.
Done a cross comparison. Yeah.
But the point being, it hasn't had a lot of negative impacts not having these designations in Wyoming. Also, I think it's also worth noting that the way the act has been used, the way that the Antiquities Act has been used in recent times, and people will be able to find exceptions to this, right? But a lot of the major designations tend to come at the end of presidencies. And by the end, I mean the last few weeks or months of presidencies, major designations occur. So in some ways, it's become used as a political tool to enhance a conservation legacy. And in many of those instances, I think if you polled the states where those designations occurred, a lot of those designations were done without really engaging or involving the local community. And there are significant impacts to the local communities when designations are done. I mean, we've talked about it on podcasts before.
That's right.
That when you designate a national monument, it raises the profile of that area. It becomes a destination. It makes people want to come there. But without the adequate resources to help, just with the operation and maintenance of that land, you can actually have some detrimental impacts to the land. You can find yourself in places where the land is in worse shape.
There's definitely a good and bad.
Yeah. So it puts you in a position where the land, you get some economic benefits. Certainly, local communities tend to benefit when you have a park or a monument designation. But the question is, how much does the land benefit? I mean, I think that's a question maybe without an answer right now, but certainly we've heard examples of lands suffering some negative consequences because there hasn't been the funding there to support the designation.
And I think we could talk about that for a long time, but I think maybe a more pressing issue before we move on is just to say, if you can imagine remember, a lot of these proposals, this argument is coming out of Utah. Remember how many of these monuments have been designated there, and realize that as people are going to these public land states and maybe designating a monument under the Antiquities Act without talking to the locals, it's built up some significant angst. And that angst is what we're seeing reprojected now, is people feeling like they don't have a voice.
Right. That feeds into it. And I think so just to wrap this bill up, I think, so what Senator Lee is saying that his Protecting Utah's Rural Communities Act would do is prohibit the president from designating or expanding a national monument in the state unless both Congress and the state legislature pass resolutions approving the designation. So it doesn't prohibit the designation. It just requires more buy-in through a process.
So what are the more controversial things that were shared? Not like this isn't non-controversial, but the other ones are more
right. So yeah, let's talk about the others. So that I'd say, yeah, Mike, you put a pretty good bow around that one. That's what he's asking to do. To be determined. We'll see what the bill says, and we can go from there and give it more analysis. The second bill is perhaps a little more controversial. This new Homestead Act idea. And I know, Nephi, you wanted to talk a little bit, because we're calling it a new Homestead Act, but what was the old Homestead Act?
Yeah, it's important for everybody to understand, basically what they're talking about with the Homestead Act. So and I'm just going to do these briefly, and again, somebody's going to email in and tell me where I'm wrong. But when you had the United States, when we were trying to grow our country across the U.S., in order to get settlers to move west, there were a number of bills, there were a number of opportunities that came out there for people to move west and take possession of lands, basically, gifted to them by the federal government if they improved those lands. Those started with the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850. That affected Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming. Settlers could get 320 to 650 acres, 640 acres, depending on whether they were single or married. And that transferred deed and title of certain lands that were improved over to settlers. Now, then you had the Homestead Act of 1862. You had some other acts, the 1866 Southern Homestead Act. You had the Timber Culture Act of 1873, the Kincaid Amendment of 1904, which let you move up to 640 acres when you were west of the 48th parallel, Dave. Is that right?
Yeah, 45th, 48th. I don't remember.
So someplace in Nebraska. So basically where you can no longer make a living off of 320 acres, they expanded the size of it. That's very similar to the Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916, which was also 640 acres, and you had to do improvement, but you didn't have to do on that. You did not have to show irrigation. But in all of these, you had instances where lands that were irrigable or were usable, an individual could go in, improve those lands, and then make a claim for title transfer of those lands. So that's the basis of the Homestead Act.
It was the policy of the federal government.
Yep.
After purchasing the Louisiana Purchase and other purchases in the West. It was the policy of the federal government to encourage development of those settlement and development of those lands for the economic benefit of the nation and the domestic security of the country.
270 million acres total, and roughly 10% of the U.S. was gifted in that manner.
Right, and so that's the historical context. There were national security reasons for wanting to do it. There were just general economic reasons for wanting to do it. So what does this new proposals of Senator Lee's look like?
It looks like he's wanting to meld the Homestead Act in the general sense, the idea of the Homestead Act with what is called the Recreation and Public Purposes Act. It seems like from his speech that what he's saying is, I want to give an opportunity for local communities to petition the federal government and say, we've got an area that, or we have a need, a public need, and we'd like to get a hold of some of that federal land and convert it for things like affordable housing, education, schools, healthcare facilities, research facilities. His argument is that in many communities that are surrounded by federal lands, you cannot find affordable housing for middle-income, families, and so there's a vast amount of land that is not, locked up as a national park or wilderness, that it could be made available for those purposes.
So this is tricky. I mean, devil is definitely in the detail in any of these.
Is he proposing? Sorry to interrupt, but is he proposing actual, or do we know, transfer as in sale of title to federal lands, or is he proposing opening up some lands to additional leases? Because there's a big distinction. We have federal land is used for all sorts of purposes today, generally in a leasing context. But when you think about it, for open pit mines, oil and gas development, uranium development,
grazing.
Solar farms, grazing, wind farms, roads, pipelines, shooting ranges, transmission quarters, ski resorts. Yeah, so a whole host of pretty significant developments that occur on federal lands already, but through leasing, not sale.
Well, he's not specific on that issue. Let's be clear on that. But nowhere really in the speech is he talking about a leased use. It's usually about the actual taking ownership of that land and having that pride of ownership that comes with the development. And basically what he's talking about is what he says is the ordinary land that is just sitting there, unused and under a federal stranglehold.
And this is really tricky because as people say that, we talked about this on another podcast, those lands that are closest to those communities, when you're talking about as an outdoorsman, as a sportsman, access for hunting and fishing, where's the place you're going to go first?
Yeah, that's the front country.
It's the place that's right next to those municipalities.
The vast majority of people are going to be using that place. That unused place is actually it's heavily used, heavily recreated
some uses, on.
It sounds like BLM land outside of communities, but who knows? I mean, without knowing the actual legislation and what it could mean.
But this one certainly has the potential to have consequences. That some of the groups that are complaining or are nervous about losing a shrinking federal estate, this certainly is something that should send up red flags for those people.
Yeah, these probably aren't lands that we're talking about. They're out in the middle of quote unquote nowhere. These are probably places that are close to,
you. Right. This might be that hunting spot in your backyard, that hunting hole of 5 miles from town, that could become a new school.
Where is that? Where is that?
I said that Nephi knows.
Oh, okay.
I don't know any honey holes. I don't have any good spots.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the third one.
Yeah. So the third one, and this is the one of the three. I think we laid these out in the progressively brighter red flag bill, right? For people that are concerned about public land transfer,
right?
Because in this one, and I don't know that he's articulated a specific bill, but he's articulated a very specific intent that his long-term objective would be transferring federal lands to the states for the states to ultimately be able to decide what the best use is for, which could include selling to the highest bidder for private development.
Right.
Yeah, and you really don't know because you don't know the first of all, you don't know state level policies in different states. You don't know what state lands agencies do, but it's important for people to remember, for anybody that thinks that this is new, it is not. So in right after FLTMA passes in 1976, you have a young senator from Utah, a guy named Orrin Hatch. And so everybody ought to know who Senator Hatch is now.
Now the old senator from Utah.
Yeah. So you had Orrin Hatch come forward, after the passage of FLTMA with the Federal Land Policy Management Act, guys. Did I get it right?
We get it wrong every time.
So. That's right. FLTMA.
Yeah, that one law. So when that passes, now you had a lot of pushback from people who lived in some of these more rural areas who started clamoring for this transfer of state lands. And at the time, Senator Hatch had multiple versions of bills moving through Congress, getting significant media attention, getting talked about, where people were thinking maybe this actually is going to be something that happens, this transfer to states. And then you had an election, and Reagan came in. And you really saw this movement called the Sagebrush Rebellion. Ronald Reagan shows up in Salt Lake City in 1980, says, "I happen to be one who cheers and supports the Sagebrush Rebellion. Count me as a rebel." So there's Ronald Reagan out there saying that. Well, under Reagan, that didn't happen. Because under Reagan, those ideas actually rolled back. And that effort rolled back where you didn't see it occur. You didn't see that transfer happen.
And so now fast forward 40 years. Right. And I think what you're seeing is roughly in the same place. Right. This is you could view this as some of the initial dialogue for starting a second Sagebrush Rebellion. Right. Mm-hmm. But I think objectively we have to look at this one too. So this one, transferring federal lands to states, this has potential consequences. There are folks, I've seen a number of stories written saying, states don't have the resources or the capacity to be able to do this anyway, even if they wanted it. And one thing I do know is there are at least I can know one state for sure, maybe more, that have commissioned a study to examine the feasibility of taking over the management of federal lands. And that report says it's infeasible, that this particular state would not have the resources to be able to do so. And actually, if they took over ownership, it would probably lead to selling off some lands. So I think the concerns might be validated that states might sell lands. They might not.
But I think that if you listen to the speech or you read the speech, the whole point is to sell them off.
It wasn't to keep public lands public. In your mind,
it is to. The goal is to restore the founders' vision of localism and self-government, so that these lands go into the hands of private landowners who can make an economic use of that land. It's not so that the state takes over ownership. It's pretty clear that he's basically saying that no.
So that's different from some of the other positions you've seen in recent years, where there have been some folks advocating for a transfer of ownership to states under the guise that states can do a better job managing and be more responsive to management concerns than the federal government can.
So in his speech, he refers to the Utah Transfer of Public Lands Act that the state legislature had.
It's 2014.
And he says, "We all agree on the problem. We all know the impact federal lands have on the lives of everyday Utahns. And we all know the real solution is to actually transfer these lands to the people." That's not mixing.
That's pretty crystal clear. Mm-hmm. That's pretty crystal clear. And so for those of you out there, and I imagine there are quite a few of you out there that are listening that would think this is not what I want to see happen. I recreate on these public lands. I don't want them to see go into private hands. What can you do? What is the likelihood, first of all, of Senator Lee's efforts succeeding in the short term? And I think around this table, we'd all agree that the likelihood on the short term of seeing this happen is almost zero. It seems, and when I'm talking short term, I'm talking in particular in this Congress, mm-hmm. but probably during this current presidential administration, seems almost certainly not something that that will move forward.
I would be surprised if any of these three bills were passed before the end of 2018, which is roughly the period of time in which this Congress ends and the next 2-year cycle of a Congress begins.
Right. So that the short-term likelihood is pretty low. And so for those of you that are very nervous on the short term, I would suggest that there are some issues that are out there short term that might be higher priority to address. Short term, right? Land and Water Conservation Fund reauthorization comes to mind. Endangered Species Act reauthorization. Funding for the National Park Service, the backlog of maintenance funding. Country's infrastructure needs, basic infrastructure needs. We've got a host of circuit court judge positions that need to be filled, and a vacancy in the Supreme Court that's going to be proposed to be filled here in the next couple of days, which, by the way, Senator Lee has consistently been on the president's short list to fill Supreme Court vacancy.
Right.
So those are pretty pressing issues in the short term. And that, if I were making a recommendation, I'd say focus on those issues in the short term. Longer term, what do you guys think?
I think longer term, first of all, I don't want to take too much time, but I think it's important that people realize that you're talking about one speech to one group. Make sure that if this is a guy that you're following and you want to know what he thinks, follow what he thinks and see what it is and get to the bottom of it. Wait for the bill to come out so you understand it. Recognize that even within Utah, you have multiple members of a delegation, and they have to be on the same page. You have to know what they're thinking, what they understand. But I think that the take home is this. You've got to talk to your elected leaders and know them at the local level, because no matter what does or doesn't get passed at the congressional level, if at the local level, the state level, if your policymakers don't understand what parameters you're okay with and what you want to look at, you're going to be in trouble. Because as people frame these bills, or they interpret these bills, or they're lobbying for different bills or different management actions, or they're talking to agencies, if they don't understand what your priorities are, you're not going to see those priorities on the ground. So let's just pretend that all land does belong to states. What are the states going to do with those lands? Well, if you don't have a local voice, if you haven't been working at the state level to express, what public lands should look like, what should be done with those lands, if you haven't started there, you're already very weak when you go to talk about it at the federal level.
Mike, what do you think?
I think I just echo what Nephi said. It's important that if there is a mechanism to transfer from federal ownership to state ownership, and then that determines how these are parceled out, you would have an effective opportunity, I guess, or an opportunity to be effective by talking to the locals and setting up the system so that should that occur, it happens in a reasonable way. But at a minimum, that is expressing your voice for how you think these public lands should be treated.
It's about access for all of us as sportsmen. We don't really, to be frank, it probably doesn't matter to us what the deed says, as long as the opportunity is there.
So I'm going to add my kind of thoughts to this too. I'm not going to repeat everything you said. I agree with everything you both said. I'd also say if you're nervous about the prospect of transfer of federal lands into private ownership or even into state ownership, yes, get involved on the state and local level. Second piece would be public perception matters. What the public thinks matters. So you're going to have those communications, but also don't be shy about continuing to advocate for your position in a public way, in a respectful way.
Absolutely.
In a respectful way, but in a way that gets your message across to the broader public about how important these issues are to you.
Be courteous, be intelligent.
Courteous, intelligent, informed, respectful.
Do your own homework.
And mine.
And ours, and we'll do more homework. Once these bills come out, we'll do more homework and dive into the specific language and see what they say. But this is our immediate response, reflections on what we heard from Senator Lee in his speech, trying to be as objective as possible. Again, we're not advocating one way or the other here. We're just trying to provide you with information.
Yep.
Just information. So don't take this as a position of your mountain. or the gentleman here. This is just providing.
This is your position, not my art, not your mountain's position. It's your position. That's what's important. You need to inform yourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Dave.
So that's it. We'll catch up with you all next time. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Your Mountain.
Mike here from the Your Mountain podcast. We need a favor. Go on our website, itsyourmountain.com, and find the links to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so that you can like and follow us, and also so that you can share us with your friends. Wherever you got this podcast from, go ahead and click subscribe, rate us, and leave a comment. These simple things will really help us get the word out. That's itsyourmountain.com. Thanks for the help.